Where do I begin? So much has happened in the last 5 days. I've lost track so much. It's been a whirlwind, to be honest with you. It was just a few days ago that my beloved master, my teacher, my friend, that he was crucified, that he was put on a cross, and he was hung and humiliated as though he was a lowly criminal. He wasn't. He was the Messiah, and thankfully, I mean, the story didn't end there. He raised from the dead, and we've seen it. You see, me and James and John and us disciples, the 12 of us that were, 11 now. We that were so close to him, we've seen him now 3 times, and really the third time we've seen him since he's come back to life. That's the story I want to tell you. Where did it start? Yes, we were on a boat. we found ourselves on a boat pretty often, but after the whirlwind of events that had gone on, and I was on a roller coaster from low lows to high highs to confusion to questions to anger. I mean, I was on a roller coaster of all roller coasters, and I needed something just to steady me, because I didn't know where to go next. And so I asked some of my boys, James and John, I asked them, Thomas and a couple others, I asked them, hey, do you want to go fishing? Because if there's nothing else, I know how to fish. And some of them came with me, and we went out on a boat, and we started to fish, and we fished, and we fished, and we fished, and we fished all night. And believe it or not, if you've ever fished, then you can relate with me. We caught absolutely nothing. Not one little minnow, not a little fish, not a little catch. We kept throwing our nets in, and they came back empty. But to be honest with you, that was okay. I fished my whole life. Some days you're out there and you're on the water and you catch nothing, and that's just part of it. That's just part of being a fisherman. But it was honestly just really good to be with my brothers. It was really good just to be on the water doing something that I knew how to do. Even if I was not catching anything, I still knew how to fish. It was what I was raised to do. It was what I knew. It's what I lived my life for before I met Jesus. And so it was a really good night, even though we weren't catching anything. And then it wasn't too long before the sun was coming up. You see, we fished through the night. And it was getting close to dawn, and we look out and we see a man on the shore. And the man yells out to us, and he says, hey, cast your net to the right. And after you don't catch anything, you kind of listen to whatever anybody says. And so we cast our net to the right. And as we do, when we throw the net into the water, we start to feel a tug. And before we know it, our net is so full. I mean, it is packed to the brim. Fish are jumping everywhere. We had spent all night catching nothing. This man on the shore tells us to throw to the right. We do, and there's lots and lots of fish. And it begins to dawn on me. I think, could that really be Jesus? Is that our Lord? And before I could even really get that thought process going, John looks at me and says, it is the Lord. It's Jesus. I knew it. I couldn't wait. You see, that was our Savior. He had been dead, and he had risen again, and we'd seen him twice, but we hadn't seen him anymore. But we hadn't seen him for a bit. So what I did is I couldn't wait on the boat to get to shore, so I threw on my outer coat and I jumped in the water. I swam to shore as fast as I could because Jesus was standing on the shore, and I had to see him. I had to talk to him. You see, this is the man that I love. This is the man that I followed. This is the man that I gave up everything for. and he was alive, and he was standing on the shore. So I rushed in, and it was a double blessing. Not only was Jesus there, but I get to the shore and realize Jesus has cooked us all breakfast. And so I was a very happy man. The rest of the disciples, they pulled the boat in and pulled up some fish, and we sat down with Jesus, and we had a nice breakfast. And I'll tell you, it filled our hearts when he broke the bread. It reminded us of less than a week ago when he broke the bread for Passover and he gave to us. That was the last meal we ate with him before he was crucified. But eating this meal again just filled our hearts. We knew that this was the resurrected Jesus. After we had a good breakfast, me and Jesus kind of were off to the side, and we got to chat one-on-one, which was good. It honestly felt like it'd been forever. It really hadn't even been that long. It'd only been a handful of days, but with so much happening, I kind of lost track of time. It felt like it'd been a long time since me and Jesus had connected. You see, a lot had happened. A lot. But anyway, we were sitting and we were talking, and Jesus looked at me. And he asked me a question, but he started his question. He said something that caught me a little off guard. He said, "Simon, son of John." And it caught me off guard because he didn't use the name Peter. And you see, Jesus gave me the name Peter. He gave me the name Peter and said that he would build his church on the rock. And Peter means rock. And so there was all this imagery of how Jesus was going to use me in the coming kingdom, in the coming church. But he didn't use the name Peter. He used the name Simon, son of John. You see, Simon, son of John was who I was before I knew Jesus. And so him calling me that, I assumed he was going to talk to me about something important or serious here. And he looks at me and he asks me the question. He says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Do I love him more than these? I mean, of course I do. And when he asked me that, I knew he wasn't talking about the other disciples. I knew Jesus was asking me, do I love him more than the fish we had caught? Do I love him more than the boat and being out on the water and having the knowledge and the control of being a fisherman? You see, that's why I think he called me Simon, son of John. Because Simon, son of John was who I was before Jesus. And then he asked me the question, do you love me more than this fishing, than the fish, than being a fisherman? Because I was a fisherman before I knew Jesus. I think Jesus was getting at my heart and asking me, do I love him more than what I knew before him? In essence, was I willing to give up my previous life for the life he may have? And of course, the answer was yes. And I told him that. I said, Jesus, of course, you know that I love you. And then he looked at me again and he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? I was confused because I just told Jesus that I loved him. He knows that I love him. But if we're being fair to Jesus, I guess the question was warranted. I mean, the last few days probably hadn't given Jesus the most security that I did love him. You see, I'd messed up a few times. I'd failed a few times when Jesus was being arrested. Back, I'll tell you the story. Back when Jesus was being arrested, and it was right before he was arrested, we had eaten the Last Supper, and we'd eaten a Passover meal together. And then Judas came in, and Judas left, and we knew he was the betrayer. But we went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and we went there with Jesus, and we took that time to pray. Now, it was later in the evening, but we stopped at a place, and then Jesus called me and John and James to go with him a little further. And we go a little further into the garden, and he asked us to pray with him for an hour. And an hour doesn't seem like it's that long, but when it is getting late and it's been a long day, an hour is a long time to pray. And so he left me and James and John, and we sat down. We started to pray. Jesus went a little further into the garden to pray by himself. And yep, I'm just going to tell you, we fell asleep. We got tired. The grass of the garden was quite soft, and we fell asleep. It wasn't too long, and Jesus came back. He found us asleep, and he woke us up, and he said, "Can you not pray with me for an hour?" And we were like, "Yes, Jesus, we definitely can. We will pray with you as long as you want." And so Jesus goes off to pray again, and once again, our eyes get quite heavy, and we fall asleep for a second time. Jesus came back, and sometimes it amazed me of how patient he was with us, but he woke us up again and asked us, "Hey, are we going to pray with him, or are we going to sleep?" And we said, "No, Jesus, we will pray with you." And for a third time, we fell asleep. And we fell asleep, and we kind of failed Jesus, which I think if we would have known this was going to be the last time we were with Jesus really before he was crucified, I think we would have stayed awake, but we didn't quite understand that at the time. And we were tired, and we fell asleep 3 times, and it felt like later that we had really let Jesus down, like we had failed. And anyway, that was one time we messed up, and then it wasn't too long after he woke us up the third time that some soldiers and some religious leaders came to arrest Jesus, and of course Judas. And they began to arrest Jesus, and you know, I had fallen asleep while we were praying, and so I really wanted to show Jesus that I cared for him. And so as he's being arrested, I can't let that happen. You see, Jesus is the Messiah. He's the one that is going to bring about his kingdom. He's going to free us from oppression. And so Jesus can't be arrested. And so I do what I think is best. I just kind of go in the moment, and I draw my sword. You see, I'm willing to die for Jesus. I was willing to fight for him. And I drew my sword, and I swung it, and I cut off this guy's ear. And things looked like they were going to get pretty violent pretty quick. But that's when Jesus stepped in. Jesus stepped in, and he looked at me, and he commanded me to put my sword up. And he looked at me, and he asked me if I was trying to take away the cup that the Father had asked Jesus to carry. And the answer to that was no. I was trying to protect Jesus, but as good as my intentions were, again, it kind of felt like I made the wrong decision. It kind of felt like I had failed Jesus. Thinking back to that story, though, Jesus did something so amazing. He picked up the ear that I cut off and put it right back on the guy. Healed him just like that. Probably made it even better than it was before. And thankfully, because it kept the rest of us probably from getting arrested. And he kind of calmed it down. But you see, it was in instances like this that I thought, you know what? This is why Jesus is asking me, do you love me? And so he asked me a second time. He said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And I said, "Jesus, you know that I love you." And then Jesus paused. And he looked at me for a third time. And he said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And it was when these words came off of Jesus' lips for a third time that I got a tightness really in my throat. It was one of those moments where your heart just kind of falls and sinks into your stomach. And because you see, I knew what Jesus was getting at. I knew why he was asking me these questions, and I knew why he asked me a third time. Because you see, I've only told you the times I failed, but these were just the minor times. You see, the worst was yet to come. After Jesus was arrested, most of the disciples, they fled. They were scared. They didn't want to be arrested. But me and John, we were going to stick by Jesus' side. If Jesus was going to have to go through torment, if Jesus was going to have to go through death, if Jesus was going to have to go through pain, he wasn't going to go alone. Me and John, we were going to be there. We were going to be there if that cost us our lives, if that cost us getting arrested. You know what? We were going to be by Jesus' side. And so as they arrested Jesus, we followed at a distance. We followed, and they took Jesus to the high priest, where they questioned him. And it was while we were outside listening to the false accusations they were trying to put on Jesus, and Jesus always responding with such calm and such poise. But while we were out there, there was an instance where somebody asked me, and they said, "Aren't you one of Jesus's followers?" I said, "Nope, I don't know him." And the first time I said it, I realized I probably shouldn't have said that, but it just kind of came, and I got scared, and I said it. But I wasn't going to leave Jesus' side. And so I continued to stay, and I continued to hear the things they asking Jesus, and it made me quite sad. I knew that the things they were accusing him of weren't true. And then somebody else recognized me and said, "Aren't you one of those followers of Jesus? Aren't you one of his close friends?" And I said, No, I think you got the wrong guy. I don't know Jesus." And the second time I was quite sad that I did it, but I had still done it. And at that point, I told myself, you know what? I've denied Jesus, but I'm not leaving his side. And as they continued to question Jesus, I saw at one point that a soldier took his fist or took his hand and slapped Jesus across the face. You see, that was my friend. That was my teacher. That was my rabbi. And he was being beaten. But that man was innocent. You see, Jesus was innocent, and yet he was being humiliated and he was being abused. But I wasn't going to leave his side. But then somebody else recognized me as one of those close followers to Jesus, that I had been with him in the garden. And I said, "I don't know Jesus." And I cursed. It was at that moment that I looked up, and Jesus looked me in the eye. You see, at one of his lowest moments, I, Peter, Simon, son of John, I failed him. I disowned him. I had failed in the past, but I had never failed like this. 3 times I denied Jesus. You see, this had been weighing on me. This had been building up guilt. And now the third time I've seen Jesus after the resurrection, he asked me 3 questions. He says, do you love me more than these? Do you love me? And then for a third time, like the third time I denied him, he said, do you love me? I said, yes, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. He said, as he had said the other couple times, he said, feed my sheep. But then he began to tell me of what one day I would endure. But then after he told me that, he said 2 simple words that took me from being heartbroken and filled with guilt to somebody that was free, to somebody that had hope. You see, after Jesus had asked me these 3 times, he looked at me and said 2 words. He looked at me and said, follow me. And it was at that moment that the past 3 years kind of came back to me, and I began to think, and it hit me. It hit me that it was just about right at 3 years before this moment that I had been on a boat. I'd been on a boat, and all I was Simon, son of John. All I was a fisherman. That's all I knew. I was just your ordinary fisherman. And it was on that day 3 years ago that Jesus got out on a boat. Then he got out on my boat after he'd been teaching the crowds. He got on my boat. We went out and we started to fish, and Jesus said, put your net in over there. Again, this was a time I hadn't caught anything, and while it sounds like I never catch anything as a fisherman, I promise you I had caught plenty of fish in my life. It was my job to catch fish. But this was, again, 3 years before was a day I hadn't caught any fish. And we'd fished and we'd fished and we fished. And now this rabbi, this teacher who isn't a fisherman, he comes out and says, throw your net over there. And this is the first time I had met Jesus. But I took my net, and we took our nets and we threw it out. And just like today, the day of this story, he said, throw it over there, and we cast our net out. And our net was so full of fish, our net began to tear. And it was that moment 3 years ago that I saw this happen, and I knew, it was that moment that I knew Jesus was different. I knew that Jesus was no ordinary man, and I dropped to my knees and I worshiped him, and I said, get away from me, Jesus. I am not worthy of you. I am sinful and broken and am not worthy of your righteousness. It was on that day, with me telling Jesus I was sinful and a failure and unworthy, that he looked at me and he said, follow me. And told me I was going to be a fisher of men. Not a fisherman, a fisher of men. But he said those 2 words. He said, follow me. Even in my unworthiness, even in my sinfulness, then he said, follow me. And then on this day, even though I had denied him 3 times, even though I had failed Jesus time and time and time and time again, even though I turned my back on Jesus in his hour of most need, even though I was still sinful, even though I was still inadequate, Jesus looked at me, Peter, and he said, follow me. If I can tell you anything, if I could just leave you with one thing, if you feel like you've failed too many times, if you feel like you are inadequate, if you feel like sin has overtaken you, if you feel unworthy, know that Jesus is looking at you with love. Just the way he looked at me. He pierced through my guilt. He pierced through my shame. He pierced through my sin, and he looked at me and said, "Follow me." Jesus looks at you and says, "Follow me."